High up in the Santa Lucia Mountains, they appear again and again, figures about 2 to 4 meters tall, silently watching the landscape. For centuries, travelers have reported these shadows, Spanish explorers, gold seekers, hikers. No one knows where they come from or what they want. People call them the Dark Watchers, Dark Guardians, whose existence has puzzled generations. In this video we follow the traces of these mysterious figures and explore the stories that have surrounded them for centuries. To understand the Dark Watchers, we need to look at the land they inhabit, the rugged mountains of central California. Off the coast stretches a mountain range known as Santa Lucia Mountains. These mountains were mapped in 1602 by the Spanish explorer and mapmaker Sebastian Vizcaino. The mountains are steep, with rugged cliffs and paths that are hard to cross. For the Spanish explorers they were a real challenge. The journey demanded courage, strength and endurance. But the Spanish pressed on. They wanted to explore the land, map the coastline and claim new territories for Spain. But long before the Spanish arrived, this land was the home of the Chumash people, one of the most important native cultures along the coast. The Chumash had lived here for centuries. They knew every valley, river, mountain and cliff. Their culture was full of stories, mysteries and traditions about spirits, guardians and other mysterious beings. As the Spanish explored the mountains, they come across something they couldn't explain. At first, they thought they were being followed or watched by the local native people, but they soon realized that that wasn't the case. They saw other beings, and they immediately knew these were not human. These beings stood on mountain peaks or cliffs, completely still. Their shape was so strange to the Spanish that they were immediately wondered if they were dealing with something supernatural. The Spanish named these beings Los Vigilantes Oscuros, the Dark Watchers. They described them as tall figures wearing long black robes and hats with very white edges. Sometimes they held a staff that they leaned on. What really disturbed the Spanish was that they had no face to make out, no eyes, no mouth, just darkness covering the head and upper body. The beings stood there, not moving, and seemed to watch their surroundings and the people. But as soon as someone got closer, they disappeared, vanishing into thin air right before the eyes of those watching. Vizcaino himself writes in his records that while the Spanish were resting in a valley, they suddenly noticed these dark figures on the mountains around them. They didn't come closer or attack, they were just there, watching, and then they vanished. For the Spanish, who lived in a time when anything unknown was quickly seen as demonic or evil, this was a deeply frightening experience. Over the centuries, similar reports kept surfacing. During the California gold rush from 1848 to 1855, gold seekers traveling the lonely mountain paths told stories of seeing figures standing silently on cliffs, watching them, and simply disappearing when someone got closer. These figures seemed especially strange during fog, twilight or sunrise. Many gold seekers wrote about their encounters in diaries and letters, or shared stories that were later collected. Often, several people reported seeing the same figures at the same time. This made the experience feel more real. It couldn't just be one person's imagination. The consistency of the descriptions across the centuries is striking. Tall, still figures, black robe, heads with white edges, no face, sometimes a staff. They appear on peaks, on cliffs, at dusk or sunrise. They do nothing but watch and vanish. In modern times, hikers, mountain climbers, photographers, and nature lovers continue to report encounters with the Dark Watchers, especially on the trails of the Santa Lucia Mountains at sunrise or sunset. These figures are said to appear. Some photographs show only blurry shapes or shadowy figures that seem to fade into the light. Others describe quiet sounds, like the snapping of sticks or the rustling of clothing, even though no one is there to be seen. Some even report a cool breeze, moving only around the spot where they thought the figure was, as if something invisible was changing the air. What's striking is that these sightings are not just one person's experience. Often, several people see the Dark Watchers at the same time. This pattern suggests that this is not some random hallucination. but a real event that people across generations have witnessed. The Dark Watchers have also appeared in books. The writer John Steinbeck published a collection of short stories titled The Long Valley. In the story, The Flight, he describes a boy named Pepe working outside, looking at the mountain range and suddenly seeing a black figure. He looks away, and when he looks back, the figure is gone. Shortly after, the same thing happens again. Steinbeck himself never publicly claimed to have seen a Dark Watcher, but his son Thomas Steinbeck later re-encountered that he repeatedly encountered these beings in his childhood. Thomas Steinbeck later worked with an artist, Benjamin Brodie, to publish a book about the Dark Watchers, which includes numerous interviews with people who reported encounters. The descriptions were strikingly similar. The writer Robinson Jeffers also mentioned the Dark Watchers in his works. Jeffers lived in Carmel by the sea, right at the foothills of the Santa Lucia Mountains. He built himself a house from granite boulders called Tor House, and he wrote about the beings in poems. For him they were a kind of geological presence, as real as the rocks, just from a different density of time. Unlike the made-up or unclear stories that sometimes grow around such legends, there is a well-documented event about the Dark Watchers that was kept in local newspaper records. In the mid-1960s, a former high school superintendent from the Monterey Peninsula went on a hike into the Santa Lucia Mountains. The group was moving along the lonely path of the range when the superintendent suddenly stopped. On a rocky ledge only a few dozen meters away from him stood a dark figure. It did not move, yet seemed to be watching the landscape and the hikers closely. What makes this encounter different from many others is how the witness reacted, and how suddenly the figure disappeared. Instead of walking away or simply fading, the superintendent called out loudly to the other hikers to get them to look at the figure. The moment his call broke the silence of the mountains, the figure vanished, right before the eyes of everyone there, just like that. There was no sound, no movement, no fog to disappear into. It was simply gone. This event, recorded in the local newspaper archives, shows the lasting features of the mystery. The appearance in the remote Santa Lucia Mountains, the tall, still figure, the quick reaction to being approached or noticed. This case shows that this was not a quick trick of the light, or something one person imagined, but a mystery seen by a group of people together. Naturally, scientists have tried to explain the event. One possibility is hallucinations or illusions, especially under conditions of tiredness, being alone, or exhaustion. People traveling alone in the mountains for long periods can mistake shadows or movements for something else, which can create feelings of fear. Another factor could be infrasound, sound waves below the range of hearing, that can trigger physical reactions, including feelings of fear, worry, and unease. Such sounds are not heard by the human ear, but can change how we see things and create figures that seem to be there. Then there are the tricks of the light, like the so-called broken spectra. That's when the light and shadow, together with fog or tiny bits in the air, create a shadow that looks like a giant dark figure. A mirage can also twist the shape of faraway things, making them seem bigger or stranger. And finally, there's a trick of the mind called pareidolia. That's when our brain tries to see faces and shapes in shadows, clouds or rocks, even when nothing is really there. Even though modern sightings and stories in books keeps the Dark Watchers in people's minds, the search for where they come from goes deep in the region past. Who were the first to see these silent watchers? Long before the Spanish arrived, the Chumash people lived in the Santa Lucia Mountains. Their stories and belief may hold clues to the Dark Watchers, but the truth is more complicated. In fact, in the known stories of the Chumash, nothing really matches the Dark Watchers as we know them, the tall, black-covered figures with hat and staff. The Chumash certainly knew many kinds of spirit beings. There were the Antep, a secret group of priests and healers who were said to have special powers and lived in the mountains. There were also stories of powerful beings who watched over people. But the specific look with European-style clothing, the long cloaks and hats with white edges, is not found in Chumash stories from before the Spanish arrived. This lack of a direct match makes the mystery even more interesting. It suggests that the specific look we know today might be a later way of seeing things, shaped by the culture of European settlers. What the Chumash saw may have been powerful spirits or ancestors. The form the Spanish later described was shaped by their own clothing and what they expected to see. But that does not mean the Chumash had no deep connection to these beings. Their relationship with the mountains was one of deep respect and humility. For Chumash, the Santa Lucias were not just a landscape, they were a living, a sacred place where spiritual forces were at work. They moved through this land with an awareness, shaped by the deep respect for the beings that lived there. One did not enter the mountains with greed or a need to own the land, but with a pure heart and the right purpose. While the Spanish explorers and gold seekers later entered the area with the goal of taking over and using the land, the Chumash approached this mountain world with humility. It is possible that this very different way of seeing things decided whether the figures were seen as protective ancestors or frightening demons. The Spanish, living in a time when anything unknown was often seen as evil, viewed the beings as a threat. The Chumash, who had lived in harmony with this land for thousands of years, likely had a deeper and more complex understanding. What do you think about today's case? What are these Dark Watchers that appear around the world, and what might their purpose be? See you next time.